In 1999, the world's first camera phone was released by the Japanese manufacturer Kyocera. It's a great example of in which ways Japan exceeds. It was ahead of its time, technologically complex and financially successful. But it accidentally became a symbol of Japanese degeneracy as well. Unlike regular cameras, the Kyocera VP210 didn't make any sounds when you took a picture, which led to a full-on epidemic of Japanese men using the phone to take creep shots of women. The manufacturers learned out of this, and that's the reason why, to this day, cameras on Japanese phones are unmutable. This is just one of many examples for weird and or kinda problematic Japanese fetish culture. There is the famous tentacle porn, lolis, and burusera shops/vending machines which sell used panties and school uniforms.
Oh my god!
Today I want to find out why so many weird fetishes appear common in Japan.
迷惑かけてばっかりなのに、いつもそばにいてくれてありがとう。お礼にパス見せてあげる！
Historically, Japan has always been a rather unique place since it's a chain of islands which for the longest time was pretty much left alone by outside civilizations. It's therefore logical that their sexual norms differ in some ways. And just to be clear, I'm not really interested in starting debates about what's right and wrong with this video. Instead, I just find it interesting that Japan's sexual culture is so different and weird from my Western European perspective, and I want to talk about the roots of that. Nevertheless, I hope we can all at least agree that consent and respect is important, and that upskirting and stuff like that is
gross, 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 gross.
Okay. Anyways, until modern times, Japan was a pretty secluded place that developed its own sexual culture. One notable thing is that, kind of similar to ancient Rome and Greece, relationships between boys and older men had been pretty normal for most of Japan's history. They were especially common under samurais and their apprentices, as well as Buddhist monks and their acolytes. Prostitution and pornography were also really common in pre-modern Japan. The latter was usually produced with woodlock prints and was enjoyed by rich and poor and men and women alike. This status quo of a pretty open and unstigmatized sex culture started to significantly change when Japan opened itself up in the 19th century after a long period of isolationism. Due to Western influences, opinions on homosexuality, for example, started to shift, and a law was passed in 1872 which forbid homosexual anal sex. Only 8 years later, it was repealed again, and homosexuality has been legal in Japan ever since, but it's clear that Western homophobia was internalized by some Japanese. Western colonial powers also had a big influence on prostitution in Japan, since for once, male colonialists and later American soldiers drove up demand for Japanese sex workers. This flourishing of prostitution reached its peak in 1945 after World War II, when the new government established official prostitution services for Allied soldiers. What's really funny about that is that the occupation had the exact opposite effect on the porn industry. All forms of sexually explicit material were forbidden during this time, and negative ideas of pornography were imposed by the Westerners onto the Japanese population. After the Allied occupation ended in 1952, prostitution soon became illegal as well. And by prostitution, I only mean sexual intercourse. And by illegal, I mean illegal for the prostitute, not the customer. That is definitely one of the weirdest anti-prostitution laws I've ever seen, and it's still in place today, even though its enforcement is pretty loose. Anyway, what happened to pornography after 1952 is pretty interesting. The ban on sexually explicit material was kept in place, but soon enough, some innovators found ways around it. You see, what these laws explicitly forbid was presenting genitalia. Otherwise, we were allowed to pretty much show everything, including rape and bondage. So that already explains a lot in my opinion, especially the tentacles. If you can't show dicks or vaginas, but literally everything else, get creative, I guess. Combine that with a thriving manga and anime culture and boom, you get a lot of unusual porn. But the censorship laws don't fully explain every weirdly common fetish. I'm looking at you, lolicon. We've already talked about the common sexual relationships between younger boys and their older mentors in pre-modern Japan, and while this may be an indicator of a cultural difference regarding sexualizing minors, the real origin of the lolicon fetish lies in the 1970s. Back then, shoujo mangas, which were meant for girls, started to explore more adult themes such as psychology, gender, and sexuality. Kind of similar to what happened to My Little Pony, this attracted a different audience than originally intended. Adult men. This gave rise to a new subculture centered around sexualizing young cartoon girls. As a matter of fact, it was the spearhead for what became modern hentai, since it shifted drawn pornography from depicting realistic bodies to using a more cartoonish style. So lolis have been a part of Japan's culture for about 50 years now. And to understand why this fetish could spread so easily and publicly back then, you need to know that even actual pornography wasn't treated differently from normal pornography until 1999.
What the fuck?
Possession of porn was even legal until 2014, and the national age of consent was 13 until 2023. Now it's 16. So, to summarize so far, a unique cultural background, as well as censorship laws and the absence of certain laws, are major reasons for Japan's in some ways degenerate fetish culture. But there's still one aspect left we need to talk about: modern Japanese. Japan is notorious for its brutal work culture, low birth rate, and loneliness. Around 50% of women and 70% of men in their 20s have no spouse or partner. 45% of adults in general have reported in 2023 that they didn't have any sexual partners for over a year. For men in their 20s, it's even 55%. Japan is a really sexless place, especially for young men, who often turn to more and more extreme pornography or sexual assault to blow off their steam. It certainly doesn't help that Japan is one of the most misogynistic societies in the developed world. Only 10% of politicians in Japan's House of Representatives are women, for example, the global average for democracies being 25%. The gender pay gap is also huge. Female income is approximately half that of men on average, and only 15% of leadership positions are held by women. One last statistic: a study from 2018 found that only 4% of Japanese people would feel comfortable having a woman as a CEO or immediate superior in a large company, compared to 63% in the US. Japan is pretty sexist. Women aren't as emancipated as in most other developed countries, and that, combined with the loneliness and sexlessness of young men, certainly contributes to degenerate and unethical sexual behavior, like with the Kyocera phone. So yeah, in conclusion, Japan is great in a lot of ways. I think in certain aspects it's a real role model. But the country has a lot of flaws, especially regarding sexuality, and it's important to acknowledge them instead of completely romanticizing Japanese society. Anyway, thanks for watching, and feel free to share your uncensored opinions in the comments, and have a nice day.